Terminator Salvation. From the Ashes. A novel by Timothy Zahn. Chapter 3. Orozco was at his usual night guard post, sleeping with his back to a broken pillar beside the archway that led into the half-crumpled building known to its residents as Moldering Lost Ashes, when he was startled awake by the sound of an approaching aircraft. He pried his eyes open, wincing at the grit that had worked its way beneath the lids. His hands, which had been cradling his M16A2 rifle in his lap, shifted automatically into a proper firing grip on the weapon. The plane was coming closer. Muttering a prayer under his breath, Orozco rolled half over and got to his feet. He hefted the M16, made sure his holstered Beretta was secure at his side, and stepped cautiously through the archway and out into the street. It was a plane, all right, a dark shadow cutting across the patches of stars as it headed westward, maybe half a click south of him. It was too dark for a recognizable silhouette, but from the sound of the engine, he guessed it was one of the A-10 Warthogs that the resistance forces in the area liked to use for air support. Orozco felt his lips press together as a second silhouette shot across the stars close behind the first. Unfortunately, the resistance probably wouldn't be using this particular A-10 much longer. The second shadow was one he did recognize, one of Skynet's cursed hunter-killers moving in for the kill. The A-10's engine pitch changed. Orozco frowned, trying to find it again against the dark sky. And then, suddenly, there it was, bearing practically straight toward him. Reflexively, he ducked as the A-10 shot past overhead, heading due north, now with the hunter-killer right behind it. Probably making for the San Gabriel Mountains, Orozco decided. Maybe hoping to lose the HK among the slopes and valleys there. But at this point, and from this distance, that was a pretty forlorn hope. Sure enough, a few seconds later there was a flash of reflected light and a rolling boom. Closing his eyes, Orozco sent a prayer skyward for the dead pilot. He opened his eyes again, frowning. The echoes of the explosion had faded, leaving the sound of a single aircraft drifting through the cold night air. And to his amazed disbelief, it was the sound of the A-10. Shaking his head in admiration, Orozco let go of his M16 with his right hand and threw a salute in the fighter's direction. He wasn't very familiar with the A-10. It was an Air Force jet, and the Marines had always used Harriers and Cobras for their close air support. But he was familiar with HKs, and any pilot who could take one down in single combat was worthy of admiration. Turning away from the sound of the distant plane, he took a deep breath of the cold night air and let his eyes drift around the ruined street he'd called home for the past 2 years. Los Angeles had been lucky, he mused. If such a word could be applied to any spot on the globe these days. The nuke that had hit the city had been a smaller one, or else had misfired enough to lower its yield a little. More importantly, its actual target had apparently been the Camp Pendleton Marine Base south of the city. Together, those two factors had worked to leave more of the city standing than had been the case with some of the world's other major metropolitan areas. Paris, for one, was gone completely, at least as near as he'd been able to glean from the scattered resistance reports he'd pulled in before his radio had finally died. New York and Chicago were in worse shape than L.A., and it sounded like everything for 100 kilometers around D.C. had been turned to slag. An empty can somewhere across the street rattled. Orozco swung the muzzle of his M16 in that direction, probing the darkness for movement. Most of the local gangs had learned to leave Moldering Lost Ashes alone, several of them learning the hard way. but you never knew when some loner would drift into the neighborhood and think he'd found easy pickings. You also never knew when Skynet would decide it was this area's turn to be cleansed of the humans that infested its shiny, brave new world. But the time for that final battle apparently wasn't tonight. The can across the street rattled again, and this time Orozco caught a glimpse of a large rat scurrying past and disappearing into the shadows. The rats, at least, had done all right for themselves in the post-Judgment Day world. So had the cockroaches. Orozco knew 8 recipes for rat and 3 for roaches. Some of the residents here knew even more. Some of those recipes were even pretty good. Judgment Day. Sighing tiredly, Orozco continued his visual sweep of the street, the bitter irony digging under his skin like the ever-present dust dug beneath his eyelids. A stupid name, Judgment Day. Someone in the Resistance had apparently coined it, and it had spread by radio and word of mouth until it was the universally accepted name for the destruction that Skynet had unleashed upon the world. But there had been no true judgment to it. None at all. Good and evil, rich and poor, sinner and saint, everyone had suffered equally in the attack. Unless perhaps the judgment aspect was in the way death and life had been handed out, that the chosen had been the ones granted the quick death of nuclear holocaust, while the evil had been those consigned to this living hell of hunger and cold and darkness. The good die young, the old saying echoed through his mind. He'd never believed that before. Maybe it was time he did. But tonight, at least, the darkness out there concealed no fresh horrors. Taking one last look around, Orozco went back inside. He was heading to his sleeping mat when a pebble clattered softly across the ground at his feet. His first impulse was to look upward, through the broken sections of flooring toward the building's top floor, where the group's lookouts were stationed. But a second later, his brain caught up with him, and he realized it couldn't have come from one of them. The lookouts always dropped their pebbles onto metal plates, where the clatter would alert Orozco or one of the other watchmen. The nearest such plate was a good 20 meters away, and impossible for the lookout to miss, which made the source of the pebble at his feet obvious. He peered a few meters down the broken tiles and cracked walls of what had once been a luxurious apartment building lobby to the pair of sleeping mats tucked into a small alcove. 9-year-old Star was half sitting up on her mat, her wide-open eyes gazing unblinkingly at Orozco, a taut, unquestioning look on her face. He gave the girl a reassuring smile and a thumbs up. Her questioning look lingered another few seconds, as if she was wondering if there really was something wrong, and Orozco was merely humoring her. But then she nodded, lay back down, and closed her eyes. He watched her a moment, and then shifted his gaze to the 16-year-old boy sleeping soundly on the mat beside her. People at the Ashes wondered about the 2 kids. They didn't wonder a lot, of course. With basic survival the top item on everyone's list, no one had much time left to spend pondering anyone else's oddities. Certainly everyone here had a long list of peculiarities of their own. But even against that backdrop, Kyle Reese and Star stood out. They weren't brother and sister. That much Kyle would readily tell anyone who asked. But how and where and why the 2 of them had linked up, that no one knew. Not even Orozco, and he was closer to them than probably anyone else in the building. It was something Kyle simply wouldn't talk about, not even when asked point blank, which a couple of the less tactful residents had done on occasion. Star didn't talk about it either. But then, Star didn't talk about anything. Whether she was physically unable to speak, or whether the trauma of Judgment Day or its aftermath had sent that part of her personality into a hole too deep for anyone to reach, was just another of the mysteries surrounding them. The system of hand signals she and Kyle used to communicate bore no resemblance to any formal sign language that Orozco had ever seen. Presumably it was something the two of them had created themselves over the years. But for Orozco, at least, the most striking thing about the two of them was their almost symbiotic relationship. They did everything together, from their work to their sentry duties to the general struggle of life, often with only a hand signal or two between them for coordination. Right now was a perfect case in point. Over the 2 years Orozco had been there, and apparently for at least a year before that, Kyle had politely but flatly refused all offers of a real room for him and Star to sleep in at night, preferring instead to stay down here as the night guard's backup. Right down here, in fact. Orozco had offered the two kids a comfy spot up on the mezzanine balcony, where Kyle could overlook the archway and act as a sniper backup. Alternatively, there were several anterooms off the lobby where he and Star would be at least partially out of harm's way. But Kyle had politely refused both offers. He'd said that it didn't count as a victory to kill an attacker if the sentry himself died in the process. Far better, he argued, for a potential attacker to see 2 armed guards, and thus abandon the attack entirely. It was a duty the boy took very seriously. Normally, any time Orozco got up to check on a noise or movement, Kyle would be instantly awake right along with him, one hand on his gun, while Star continued to sleep. But on those rare occasions like tonight, when Kyle was so tired that he slept through one of Orozco's spot checks, Star invariably woke up instead, watching and waiting until Orozco gave her the all-clear. It was as if, on some subconscious level, their two minds had agreed in advance which one would be on duty that night, and adjusted their sleep accordingly. Orozco had seen that sort of near telepathy before, but normally only between members of highly trained and highly experienced military units. He'd only rarely seen it in civilians, and never between kids this young who weren't related. The A-10's engines had faded into the background now. Orozco wondered briefly whether it would find some hiding place before Skynet scrambled more of the HKs. Then put the thought out of his mind. That was the pilot's problem, and Orozco had more than enough problems of his own. His eyes drifted back to the 2 sleeping figures in the alcove. No, he decided. Judgment Day hadn't been about taking the good and leaving the evil, not when people like Kyle and Star were still here. Once again settling his back against the pillar, Orozco laid his M16 in his lap and drifted off to sleep.